The job was supposed to be simple. I worked night shift maintenance at a coastal public school just outside a small town. Nothing fancy, just a big, aging building that always smelled faintly of damp wood and floor wax. My shift started at 9:30 p.m. and ended around 5 a.m., right before the first staff arrived. Most nights were the same routine. Empty trash, mop hallways, check doors, turn off lights. The kind of work you can do half on autopilot once you learn the building's rhythm. But there was one place I always avoided until the very end: the auditorium. It was old, built decades ago when the school first opened. A massive room with tiered seating, heavy curtains, and a stage that seemed too large for the building it belonged to. During the day, it was fine. Students used it for assemblies and performances. At night, it felt different. Not just empty, but attentive, like it was waiting for something. I usually saved it for last because I wanted to get in, clean quickly, and leave before my mind had time to settle into it. That was my rule. Don't stay long enough for your imagination to start helping. One Tuesday in late autumn, I broke that rule without meaning to. The rest of the building had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, actually. No interruptions, no odd noises, nothing out of place. That kind of quiet can make you lower your guard without realizing it. By the time I reached the auditorium doors, it was just after 2 a.m. I remember hesitating with my hand on the metal handle, not because I heard anything, but because I didn't. No hum of HVAC, no distant creaks from the building settling. Even the parking lot outside had gone silent, as if the world had stepped away from the school entirely. I pushed the door open. The sound echoed too loudly. Inside, the air was colder than the hallway, the kind of cold that doesn't belong indoors. I flipped on my flashlight and stepped in, letting the doors swing shut behind me. The beam cut across rows of empty seats. Dust floated through the light like slow-moving ash. I started with the aisles, sweeping from bottom to top. The broom made a soft scraping sound that kept bouncing back at me from the walls. After a while, I stopped noticing it. Or at least I tried to. Then I heard something else. A faint shuffle. I paused. Nothing moved. I stood still for a few seconds, listening. The sound didn't repeat, so I told myself it was probably just the wind slipping through a vent somewhere. I kept working. About 10 minutes later, I was halfway up the seating when I noticed something that didn't belong. A small program booklet lying on a seat, folded neatly like someone had placed it there on purpose. I frowned. The auditorium had been empty all day. No event scheduled, no rehearsal, nothing. I walked over and picked it up. It was old, edges yellowed slightly like it had been sitting there for a while. But when I flipped it open, the pages were blank. Completely blank. No print, no writing, nothing. That was the first moment I felt something tighten in my chest. I looked around the room slowly, flashlights sweeping across the rows. Everything looked normal again, but now I was paying attention in a different way. The silence felt heavier. I set the booklet back down and told myself to finish quickly. That's when I heard footsteps. Not loud, not running, just slow, deliberate steps crossing the stage above me. I froze instantly. The stage was behind the heavy curtains, slightly elevated with wooden steps on either side. I aimed my flashlight towards it, but the curtains were closed. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then, after a few seconds, they started again. Same pace, same direction, like someone pacing back and forth, thinking. I called out without thinking. "Hello? Maintenance." My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the room. The footsteps stopped immediately. That made my stomach drop, because it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. I climbed the side steps to the stage slowly, keeping the flashlight ahead of me. The curtains were thick, dusty velvet. I pulled one aside. The stage was empty. Old chairs stacked in the corner, a few props from a past school play. Nothing moved, but the air felt wrong up there. Stagnant, pressurized, like the room was holding its breath. I checked behind the curtains, under the stage edges, even the wings on both sides. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I stepped back down, I heard something again, this time closer, a whisper. Not words I could understand, just the shape of speech right behind my left shoulder. I spun around fast. Nothing there. My flashlight beam shook slightly as I scanned the rows again. That's when I noticed something new. The booklet was gone. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen anyone take it. It was just not there anymore. I backed towards the exit a few steps, telling myself I was done with the auditorium for the night. I could come back tomorrow, finish it during daylight hours when things made more sense. But as I turned towards the doors, I saw something that made me stop completely. The exit doors weren't fully closed. They were slightly open. I was certain I had shut them behind me when I came in. I always did. That was part of my routine. A thin line of cold air drifted through the gap. Then I heard the whisper again. Clearer this time. Right behind me. Except this time it wasn't just sound. It felt like my name was being spoken without a voice. I didn't turn around again. I just walked towards the exit, slowly at first, then faster. And as I reached for the handle of the door, I noticed something that made my hand stop midair. There were faint footprints on the stage behind me. Bare, uneven, heading in my direction. And they were fresh. I stood there with my hand halfway to the door, staring at those footprints on the stage. Bare, uneven, and pointed directly toward me. For a second, my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe they were old. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them earlier. But I knew that wasn't true. The dust around them looked disturbed, like someone had just stepped there moments ago. And I hadn't heard anyone move. Not once. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost like it was right beside my ear instead of behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing solid, just a subtle shift in the darkness between the seats, like something settling back into place after being seen. That was enough. I grabbed the door handle and pulled it open fast. Cold night air rushed in. The hallway lights outside felt painfully bright compared to the auditorium's darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, half in and half out, trying to convince my body to move. Then I stepped out and pulled the door shut behind me. The sound of it closing echoed longer than it should have. I locked it immediately, twice. My hands were shaking harder than I wanted to admit. I leaned against the wall outside the auditorium, trying to steady my breathing. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, long shift, tired mind, old building, shadows doing what shadows do. But none of that explained the footprints, or the booklet disappearing, or the whisper that sounded like it knew me. I stayed there for maybe a minute or two, long enough to convince myself I was done with that room for the night. Then I heard something from inside. A single thud, like something heavy had shifted on the stage. I froze. No way that was wind. No way that was settling. Then another sound followed it, softer, slower. Footsteps again, except this time they weren't pacing. They were coming toward the stage edge. And then they stopped right behind the door I had just locked. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. It felt positioned, intentional, like whatever was inside had walked straight to where I stood and waited on the other side. No movement, no sound, just presence. I backed away from the door without turning my back to it and headed down the hallway fast, not running but close. My shift wasn't technically over, but I didn't care anymore. I wanted out of the building. I cut through the main corridor toward the security office near the entrance, passing classrooms that all felt a little too dark that night. Every reflection in the glass doors looked wrong, like it took an extra second to match my movement. When I reached the security office near the entrance, I stopped. The monitor on the desk showed the auditorium camera feed. I hadn't checked it in weeks. Most nights it just showed an empty stage and empty seats. But now it was different. The camera was pointed at the auditorium doors, and they were slightly open.
I stared at the screen, not fully understanding what I was seeing at first. I was sure I had locked them. I remembered the second turn of the key. Then I noticed something else. On the screen, faint movement inside the auditorium, just barely visible through the gap of the doors. Something shifting between the seats. I didn't wait to see more. I unplugged the monitor, not because it made sense, because I didn't want to know what it would show next. I left the office and went straight to my car. Once I was outside, I sat there for a while with the engine off, just staring at the building. From the parking lot, it looked completely normal again. Quiet, dark, empty. No sign of anything wrong. That made it worse. I drove home without stopping. I didn't tell anyone that night, not right away. I needed time to convince myself it had an explanation, some rational chain of events I had missed. A student hiding, a broken lock, a trick of sound bouncing in a large empty room, but none of it sat right. A few days later, I tried to talk to one of the other maintenance guys about the auditorium. I kept it vague, asked if anyone else ever had issues with doors or movement in there during night shifts. He laughed and said I was probably just getting spooked by the old stories. Apparently, the auditorium had a reputation. Years ago, a stage worker collapsed during setup for a school event. Heart issue, died before anyone could help. Since then, people like to say strange things happened in there at night. Lights flickering, sounds on the stage, footsteps when no one was there. Classic stuff. I didn't like hearing that, but I also didn't want to admit how much it lined up with what I experienced. Because what I saw didn't feel like a story. It felt immediate, like something reacting to me in real time. After that night, I avoided the auditorium entirely. If I had to clean nearby hallways, I'd do it fast and never look at the doors directly. Even thinking about them made me feel uneasy, like my mind was replaying a memory I didn't fully understand. A week later, I was scheduled for another night shift alone. Around 3 a.m., I was mopping near the main hallway when I heard something distant. A faint sound, like footsteps crossing a large wooden floor. I stopped immediately. The sound wasn't coming from my level. It was above me, the auditorium balcony level. I stood still for a long time, mop dripping onto the tiles, listening. Nothing else followed. No whispers, no movement. Just that single reminder, like something was still there, even if I wasn't looking at it. I didn't go near the auditorium that night, or any night after that when I was alone. Eventually, I transferred to a different building altogether. Same job, different site. Smaller school, newer construction, less history. No auditorium like that one. But even now, sometimes when I work late in quiet halls, I catch myself listening for things that don't make sense. A second set of footsteps that stops when I stop. A sound that feels like it's trying not to be noticed. And every time I pass a large empty room with a stage or raised platform, I don't look inside for long. I already know what it feels like when something looks back. When I was 17, there was a girl at school named Elena Mercer. Even now, almost 10 years later, I can still picture her perfectly. She had this way of making people uncomfortable without doing anything obvious. It wasn't that she was rude or openly hostile, she just carried herself like she existed on some separate wavelength from everyone else. While the rest of us stumbled through high school trying way too hard to fit in, Elena looked like she had already decided none of it mattered. She wasn't popular. She wasn't exactly unpopular either. She was just there. Quiet. Observant. Detached. Most people thought she was strange. Some people thought she was intimidating. A few guys thought she was hot in that mysterious, emotionally unavailable way teenage boys always convince themselves is attractive. I was one of those guys. Looking back, obsessed is probably the right word. Not in a creepy stalker sense, more in the painfully awkward, overthinking every interaction kind of way that only a 17-year-old can manage.
I'd spend entire classes half listening to lectures because I was too busy wondering what she was writing in her notebook or what music she listened to through those giant black headphones she always wore. There was something about her silence that pulled people in, like she knew something nobody else did. I wrote a lot back then, mostly fantasy stories I was way too proud of. Badly written kingdoms, tortured heroes, cryptic villains, typical teenage stuff. And for whatever reason, I'd named one of the main characters Elena. Not because of her. At least, that's what I told myself. One afternoon, after chemistry, I was walking upstairs with my friend, Tyler. We were talking about my story because he had been making fun of me for still writing dragon nerd stuff, as he called it. He asked what the main characters were named. I rattled them off. And the second I said Elena, I heard someone laugh behind me. I turned. There she was, standing 2 steps below me with one of her friends. She looked directly at me with this faint smirk. "Oh," she said, "you named a character after me. That's cute." I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. Tyler was already cracking up. I started stammering some explanation about how it was just a coincidence. She kept staring. Not meanly, not kindly either, just waiting. And then, in what remains the most impulsive decision of my teenage life, I blurted out, "Do you want to go out sometime?" Tyler actually choked. Elena tilted her head slightly. For a moment, I thought she was going to laugh. Instead, she said, "Sure." Just like that. No hesitation, no expression. She pulled my phone from my hand before I could react, entered her number, handed it back, and walked upstairs without another word. Tyler stared at me like I'd just diffused a bomb with my teeth. I barely slept that night. The next day, she texted me. Not hey, not small talk, just a location pin and one message. Saturday, 10 a.m. Wear decent shoes. That was it. No explanation, no actual invitation, just instructions. I should have found that weird. Instead, I was thrilled. Saturday morning, she picked me up in this beat-up silver Subaru that looked older than both of us combined. She didn't say much during the drive, just kept her eyes on the road while low, unfamiliar music played through the speakers. Not pop, not rock, something instrumental and eerie. The kind of music that feels unsettling even when nothing is happening. I tried making conversation, asked where we were going. She just said, "You'll see." The drive lasted about 45 minutes, far enough outside town that houses became sparse and cell service dropped to 1 bar. Eventually, we turned onto an unmarked gravel road and pulled into a small dirt lot surrounded by pine trees. There were only 2 other cars parked there. No signs, no map, just a narrow trail disappearing into the woods. "This is your date idea?" I asked. "It is now," she said. Then she got out and started walking. I followed. The first 20 minutes were surprisingly normal, pleasant even. The trail wound through tall pines and crossed a shallow creek over an old wooden bridge. Sunlight filtered through the branches in these fractured beams that made everything look cinematic. And for the first time ever, Elena actually talked. Not much, but enough. She asked about my writing, asked what kind of stories I liked, asked why you always looked at me in chemistry like you were trying to solve a puzzle. That last one nearly made me trip over a root. I laughed awkwardly and said I didn't know what she meant. She smirked. Sure. She had this way of saying simple words that made them feel loaded, like she knew exactly what you were thinking and found it mildly amusing. The trail eventually split into 2 directions. One path was wide and clearly maintained. The other was narrow, overgrown, barely visible beneath dead leaves. Without hesitation, Elena took the narrower path. I stopped. "Are you sure?" She looked back at me. "Yes." Something about the certainty in her voice made me follow without another question. The further we went, the stranger things felt. The trees thickened. The trail became little more than flattened brush. Birdsong disappeared. Even the air felt different somehow. Still, heavy. I kept telling myself I was just nervous because I was alone in the woods with the girl I'd spent months fantasizing about. Then Elena stopped. She turned to me. "You go first." I frowned. "Why?" "I want to take pictures." She held up her phone. I laughed. "Of me hiking?"
Yes. It was weird, but again, 17-year-old me was operating with critical thinking skills of a golden retriever, so I shrugged and moved ahead. The path narrowed so that branches scraped both shoulders as I walked. I could hear Elena's footsteps behind me at first. Then I couldn't. I stopped, turned around. She was gone. At first, I genuinely thought she was messing with me. "Very funny," I called. No answer. I walked back 20 yards. Nothing. The trail behind me was empty. Elena? Still nothing. A knot formed in my stomach. I hurried back to the fork. She wasn't there either. No movement, no sound, just trees. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. I stood there trying to think logically. Maybe she'd stepped off trail for some reason. Bathroom, phone call, something. But there were no obvious side paths, no obvious place she could have gone. And then I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere off to my left, deep in the trees. I froze. There was movement behind a thick pine trunk, a figure partially hidden. Relief hit instantly. Elena? The figure stepped out. It wasn't her. It was a man. Mid-40s maybe. Tall, broad shoulders, wearing a dark jacket and faded jeans. He just stood there staring at me, expressionless. I laughed nervously. "Sorry, I thought it was my friend." No response. Then another branch cracked, this time to my right. I turned. Another man stood there, shorter, stockier, holding what looked like a thick tree limb. That's when instinct finally kicked in. I ran. The second I bolted, both of them did too.
The woods exploded into noise behind me. Branches snapping, boots pounding against dead leaves, heavy breathing. I'd never experienced real fear before that moment. Not the kind movies try to imitate. Not the kind you feel watching a horror trailer alone at night. This was something primal, a full-bodied command from my brain screaming one thing: run. I tore through the trees with no idea where I was going. The forest was too dense to move fast, but adrenaline made everything blur together. Branches clawed at my face and arms, roots caught at my shoes. Behind me, they kept coming. Neither man shouted, neither said a word. That somehow made it worse. If they'd yelled threats or insults, maybe I could have understood it, could have processed what was happening. But the silence made them feel less human. Just two forces moving through the woods with one purpose: to catch me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Big mistake. My foot snagged on something buried under leaves. I pitched forward hard, smashing face first into the ground. Pain exploded through my mouth. I tasted blood instantly. Before I could scramble up, weight slammed onto my back. One of them. He grabbed for my shoulders, trying to pin me. I screamed, pure panic-fueled animal noise. I twisted wildly, kicking backward with everything I had. By sheer luck, my heel connected with something soft. The guy grunted. His grip loosened just enough. I rolled hard to the side and scrambled upright. The second man was only a few yards away, still holding that branch. I didn't think. I charged straight between them. One grabbed my jacket. The fabric tore. I kept running. At that point, I wasn't even trying to navigate. I was just moving, crashing through brush, ignoring the sting of branches tearing my skin, ignoring the blood running from my split lip, ignoring the burning in my lungs. Eventually, the trees thinned, and then suddenly I burst back onto the main trail. I nearly collapsed from relief. The open path stretched ahead toward the parking lot. I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back again until I reached the lot. No one was behind me. The two men were gone. I doubled over, gasping. My entire body shook uncontrollably. That's when I noticed Elena's Subaru was still parked exactly where we left it. Empty. The driver's side door locked. No sign of her anywhere. A fresh wave of dread hit me. For one horrible moment, I thought those men had gotten her too, that maybe she'd been attacked somewhere deeper in the woods. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number, straight to voicemail.
Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. I was about to call 911 when my phone buzzed. A text from Alina. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen in disbelief. Then movement caught my eye. I looked up. She was walking out of the tree line about 50 yards away, completely calm. No panic, no urgency, no sign she'd been running. Her hair was neat, her clothes spotless. She moved at a casual pace like she'd just stepped away to take a short walk. I ran toward her. "Where the hell were you?" She blinked. "What?" "There were 2 men back there." I was practically shouting. "They chased me." Her expression didn't change. She just stared. Then she said, "I thought you kept walking." I laughed, not because anything was funny, because my brain genuinely didn't know how to process what she'd just said. "I went back for you." She shrugged. "I guess I took the wrong turn." It was such a flat, rehearsed response that my stomach dropped. "No," I said. "There wasn't another turn." She said nothing, just unlocked her car and got in. For a second, I stood there frozen. Every instinct told me not to get in that vehicle, to call the police, to run. But I was 17, bleeding, shaking, and still trying to convince myself there had to be some innocent explanation. So I got in. The drive back was the longest 45 minutes of my life. The eerie instrumental music played softly through the speakers. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. I kept glancing at her, waiting for some crack in her expression, some sign of fear or guilt or confusion. There was nothing. Finally, I said, "Did you know those guys?" Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "No." "You disappeared." "I told you, I thought you kept going." "That doesn't make sense." She sighed like I was being annoying. Why would I lie? That question sat in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. What possible reason would she have to lure me into the woods? For what? Robbery? I didn't have anything worth stealing. Some kind of prank? That seemed way too extreme. Something worse? The thought made me nauseous. When we reached my house, she pulled into the driveway. Neither of us moved. Finally, she looked at me. For the first time all day, her expression shifted. Not to concern, not to apology, to something almost like amusement. Very faint, barely there. "You're overthinking it," she said. Then she smiled. It was the only real smile I ever saw her give. And somehow it terrified me more than anything that happened in those woods. I got out without another word. She drove away. I never saw her outside school again. I avoided her completely, changed my route between classes, skipped lunch if she was in the cafeteria. A few times I caught her watching me. She'd hold eye contact just long enough to make my skin crawl, then look away. I considered telling someone. Teachers, my parents, the police. But what would I even say? A girl took me hiking and I got chased by 2 random men? There was no proof, no evidence, nothing except my own panic-stricken memory. Graduation came 6 months later. Elena didn't attend. No one seemed to know why. After that, she vanished. No social media, no college announcements, nothing. It was like she disappeared. For years, I told myself I'd exaggerated everything, that fear had distorted my perception, that maybe she really did get lost. Maybe those men were just hikers who reacted badly when they startled me. I almost believed that. Then 3 years ago, I got a message on Facebook from Tyler, the same friend who had been with me on the stairs that day. He asked if I remembered Elena. I said yes. He told me his younger cousin had gone to the same school after us. Apparently, during her sophomore year, Elena briefly dated another guy. Took him hiking. Same trail, same secluded area. He came back bruised and hysterical, claiming 2 men had chased him through the woods after Elena vanished. No one believed him either. When he confronted her at school, she denied everything. A week later, she transferred. That was the last confirmed sighting anyone seems to have of her. I've spent years trying to understand it. Maybe she was working with those men. Maybe she was Bite, luring isolated boys into the woods for whatever sick reason. Maybe she got some thrill out of it. Or maybe she was being forced. Maybe she was trapped in something she couldn't escape. I don't know. And honestly, I'm not sure which possibility is worse. What I do know is this. A few months ago, I was clearing out old boxes in my parents' attic when I found my high school creative writing notebook, the one with that fantasy story. I flipped through it for nostalgia, and on the very last page, written in neat handwriting that definitely wasn't mine, were 6 words. "You should have kept running, Owen." I still have no idea when she wrote it, or how she even got access to that notebook. I haven't slept well since finding it.